Well, good evening and welcome to tonight's show. Just a few things before I introduce this evening's special guest. You might have been aware of the news from the Western Isles, where the council took a vote about John Swinney's disgusting, corrupting education materials, and by 23 votes to 4, the councillors voted to reject them and say, effectively, not on your life. We're not having these in the schools in the Western Isles. So that was good news. That story is maybe not quite completely finished yet. Watch this space. But there's a video I made on YouTube you can watch about that. But that's a very interesting development, I think. Right, we've just got one more show next week before we take a little Christmas break. And next week, I'm not going to be involved in the main discussion. We're going to have Philip Tanzer and Belinda Brown, who are going to talk about so-called conversion therapy and the steps towards outlawing it. So that should be fascinating next week. Now, one thing to emphasize here, this is actually not live. It's a bit of a con. It says live streaming. It isn't. Our special guest tonight couldn't make it on Wednesday. So we're recording this on Monday. But now I'm going to be live in the chat on Facebook and on YouTube. So I'll be interacting a bit more with the comments during this. So hopefully it will still have an interactive element to it. Right. This evening's guest is Paul Gilfillan, who is a sociologist, senior lecturer at Queen Margaret University, and he specializes in politics, religion, education, and nationalism. So quite a substantial overlap with the Scottish Family Party's area of interest. Now, Paul spoke at our conference last year as well. It was absolutely fascinating. So really looking forward to what he's going to have to say to us tonight. So welcome, Paul. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Richard.
Yeah, pleasure to have you. So do you want to tell us something about your recent research projects, things that have been relevant to the political scene, to the family party's areas of interest?
Well, what I'm researching just now, Richard, obviously we'll have a chance to chat about it at great length, is I'm doing some studies on nursing education. At Queen Margaret, we have nursing programs, and I've been doing some qualitative interviews with nursing students. I'm also very much interested in the religion, specifically Catholicism. I'm writing something just now for Oxford University Press. There's a 5-volume history of Catholicism. So I'm writing about the Scottish context. And that's a kind of preamble to a much bigger piece of work, hopefully, that will be coming out in maybe 2 or 3 years' time.
Okay, that all sounds interesting. Now, a particular topic this evening is to do with religion and education. Just before we launch into that, just to re-emphasize as we have to say to people quite regularly, the Scottish Family Party is a secular party. In other words, it's not founded on any religious principles. There's people there are Christians, there are Muslims, people with religious beliefs, and there are plenty of people in the Scottish Family Party who don't follow any religious faith at all. A political party is about people who agree with a set of policies. And our policies might align with religious beliefs for some people, but they're not in themselves exclusively religious. But just this is a very relevant topic because education is one of our focuses, and this is very much a relevant aspect of education in Scotland. So, Paul, tell us about what you've been looking at in the area of education and religion.
Well, prior to being a lecturer at Queen Margaret, Richard, I was at the University of Glasgow. And I did some research with a team of people into religious observance. So maybe I could kick off by talking a bit about that. Mm-hmm. So religious observance, that is a term that is used here in Scotland for what in England and Wales is called collective worship. So in Scotland, religious observance is basically assembles of the whole school or whole classes and devoted to normally, or well, certainly historically, a Christian liturgical act in common with other people. Now, in 2005, the Scottish Government introduced new religious observance guidelines. And a few years later, in 2008, myself and Ewan Aitken, we did a kind of small qualitative study, and we looked at how the new religious observance guidelines were doing. Now, we looked at the non-denominational sector, so it's important to say that some of the things I want to talk about is specific to the non-denominational sector. Now, just to give a little background to listeners, way back since 1872, there's been a requirement that schools provide some kind of religious input. And government guidelines that were issued in 1991 maintained this original requirement to deliver some kind of broadly Christian service. However, school inspectors in 2001, they reported that these guidelines were being largely ignored by 2/3 of non-denominational secondary schools. So the Scottish Government in 2001 established a review of religious education. And a few years later, in 2005, they issued new guidelines. And these new guidelines are what myself and Ewan did some research in, going into schools and to kind of find out how they were bedding down. So again, I know, I appreciate it's a bit of a kind of specialist area. So let me kind of briefly summarize what were the main changes. So the big change as of 2005 is that the traditional link, the link that had been there since 1872, the link between religious observance and broadly conceived religious Christian worship, it is no longer insisted upon in non-denominational schools. Schools as of 2005 now have the freedom to replace Christian worship by what is often glossed as a kind of less divisive or more inclusive, depending on your point of view, emphasis upon something called spiritual development. And clearly, when we ask what's spiritual development, this is defined now as being helped, the pupils being helped to recognize and develop a deeper understanding of the intrinsic value of a person. Now, part of the reason why this is of interest is somebody like me, like a sociologist. In the foreword to the 2000 report by the review group, the Religious Observance Review Group, the chairwoman stated that we are trying to update the new guidelines to make them religious observance inclusive and reflecting of Scottish society as it is today. So when we went in, as I say, most of what I'm going to say to you tonight is about, if you like, those instances where religious observance wasn't being delivered as it could be or as it ideally should be. Now, so it's important for me to say that when we went into primary schools, for example, we found fantastic examples of religious observance in non-denominational primary schools. But what we did find in secondary schools, it was, how do I put it? Depending on your point of view, you could say it was like kind of coming upon a scene of cultivated nihilism, kind of like a bit of a desert experience.
So just go back to the primary schools. Was that delivered by teachers or by people coming in?
Ordinarily, in our experience, it was, Richard. However, schools are absolutely free to, to have a local minister, a local priest, or whatever to come in and to deliver some kind of religious observance. Head teachers, they're absolutely free to arrange it as they see fit, basically. They have a lot of leeway as to who actually delivers it. Practically speaking, what often happens is that a particular school will develop a relationship with an individual or a group of individuals, and they normally would deliver it. But if it's not done, that's if it's not done in-house. Lots of RO in the primary schools were very good, but when myself and Ewan went into secondary schools, I won't say the names of the schools or even the local authority, but it is fair to say that there was a tremendous sense of alienation among secondary school pupils from, if you like, not only organised religion, but the whole kind of language of spirituality or spiritual development. And, depending upon your own point of view, you could describe it as a kind of, kind of desert experience, if you like. I remember, the reason I'm smiling is because I remember one particular morning, after myself and Ewan, we did a lot of interviewing with pupils, etc. And in mid-afternoon, we finished. And myself and Ewan, we just had to go and have a little debrief to ourselves in a cafe someplace. And this was the first time in the whole morning that we'd been actually alone together. And we kind of looked at each other and we kind of started laughing. We were trying to process the level of barefaced resentment at the whole idea of spirituality from pupils. And it was actually quite, there was a lot of it was quite tough to take, actually, to have that to be exposed to a concerted undercurrent of dismissive mocking of spirituality. It was almost, myself and you, we thought about this, and it was almost as if these were pupils who were resentful and angry at the very mention of spiritual development. It was almost as if it was a trigger word. I don't know if back in 2008 we even had that idea of being triggered. It was clear that when pupils were asked about, spiritual development, what does it mean to be a spiritual person, they really had no clue whatsoever. And, they didn't have models of it, they didn't know how to talk about it or make sense of it. And so that was a very clear finding. We went into schools looking for the impact of the new ARO guidelines. But whatever the answers to those particular questions, it was clear that these young people don't do religion, don't pray, don't know anyone in their family who is or who does, and they have no models of a life in which spirituality, is really important. And again, talking to head teachers and teachers themselves, this was a shared problematic, Richard. It wasn't just a question of some pupils not being able to have some coherent answer to these issues. Teachers themselves, it was almost as if there was they were actually embarrassed at having to deliver a topic that they really didn't know anything about. As I say, I was struck by the sense of alienation of secondary pupils from, well, obviously from Christianity, but spirituality broadly defined. So chatting with head teachers was really, really interesting. There was very little enthusiasm at all for the new guidelines. One of the things that chatting to teachers told us was that our research actually was flawed. The new religious observance guidelines were meant to be reflective of the usual, the new multicultural, multi-faith and multiracial British society. Now, we just didn't research in a multicultural context, for a multi-faith context. The schools that we researched, they were overwhelmingly white, unchurched Christian cultural backgrounds. And one of the things that was interesting was that head teachers, when you actually got to when you got past formalities, head teachers were, they were pleading for help to accomplish spiritual development. When they let their guard down and you really got down to how they felt they were doing in terms of spiritual development, they were frank and happy to admit that they were totally out of their depth. And they were desperate for people to come in and model spirituality for them. But oftentimes they just didn't know anybody who could do it. That made a strong impression on us. After the research, 1 or 2 years afterwards, I helped put together a bid for research funds to the ESRC to address some of these issues, but unfortunately the grant application wasn't successful. A key part of the research that I wanted to do was to meet the need for a number of high-quality exemplars of what spiritual development actually looks like, up close and personal. These were clearly needed, but as I say, my efforts at securing funds for research weren't successful. Another clear item that we found, Richard, was not just secondary school pupils, but bright P7s. They found religious observance boring, intellectually vacuous, not stimulating, certainly not challenging. And perhaps you're aware of this critique, Richard, that pupils themselves, they would characterise, and this isn't just religious observance, but it also includes religious and moral education. They would characterise it as a a contentless vagueness. I mentioned just a few minutes ago this idea, asking young people what does being a spiritual person mean to you, and they had no idea. no models to offer us. Even if only to break the awkward silence when, as researchers, you're asking these questions. And as I say, this is not confined to religious observance. Also, when I was at Glasgow University, I was part of an ESRC, AHRC funded 3-year research period, and we asked the question, does religious education work? And one of the strong findings, now this was a UK-wide study, and one of the strong findings was the lack of intellectual rigor in religious education. And that this was a direct cause of a sense of disenchantment among pupils with RE discussions. Classroom discussions often became pointless among students. If something important, and if important truths are not at stake, then pupils would just ask, what's the point of asking us to take it seriously? And again, this is part of the problem, that there's a lack of, there's a politics to what is and isn't in the classroom. And even bright primary 7 kids would recognize that there was an intellectual kind of vacuity to this paradigm. But anyway, so in terms of the RO study, again and again, we found teachers are tied to, if you like, non-denominational content, or maybe to put it better, to traditionalist content. And, so you end up in a classroom situation when every opinion is valid, truth is never arrived at. And of course, interesting, we asked teachers if they talk to their pupils, if teachers shared their own, truths as they saw it. And more than often, they didn't. In the secondary school context, teachers didn't talk of their own moral and spiritual development. And of course, that was quite interesting. One of the things I mentioned earlier, Richard, I'm also interested in looking at doing some research about the 4th-year nursing students. And my interim conclusion, I haven't published anything on this so far, but my interim conclusion is that what you see happening in education in schools, you also see the exact same thing happening with nursing programs. What is happening is that they are reproducing the kind of liberal public sphere in miniature, insofar as, for example, they only tolerate religiosity in their students and patients. Imagine just being tolerated. They don't dare positively recognize and esteem religious belief, for example. And of course, my best guess as to why that is that it's a kind of taboo. To do that would be to no longer, if you like, be nice kind of secular humanist liberals, but probably be kind of labeled as some kind of fundamentalist. So what I've found is that these nursing programs, they actually produce graduates who are educated in how to not esteem religious patients. They're taught to merely tolerate them as a kind of good secular liberal duty. And it sounds, it can sound great in practice. It sounds great in theory, but in practice, it means nursing students with religious beliefs are tolerated, and they're never really valued and recognised and celebrated. So educators of nurses with religious beliefs would never dare to refer to them in their educational practice. So again, the great irony is you have nursing programs that advertise themselves as being person-centred, but all the lecturers actually model how to remove all traces of religion from their person when in public. It's person-centred so long as the religious person kind of cuts himself in half or something. And so what is happening, but this is also happening in education, I find, Richard. There's a kind of an embarrassment at questions of meaning. And teachers pass on the confusion, pass on the inability to kind of celebrate it and dive into it. And that is communicated to their pupils. So back to RO, that's why we found pupils that, for example, they're unable to talk about their moral experience, their experience of goodness, obligation, conscience. and of course, that is a serious lack of being able to kind of put oneself into words. If you're trying to produce young people who can articulate the dignity, but you don't give them a language within which to speak to these depth experiences of morality, for example, then it's almost as if you're giving them the goal but taking away the means. So, there's all kinds of interesting things that goes on.
Yeah. With these trends, to what extent do you think it's just an inevitable reflection of changes in society? Or do you think it could have been different? Has it been leading or following culture, do you think?
Well, I'm still trying to kind of answer that question satisfactorily to myself, Richard, but I think the review got it wrong. Part of the problem is that the review of religious observance wanted to have a one-size-fit-all answer, which is just already kind of setting up for failure. By all means, have a new paradigm of RO. But what I think is needed, rather than a kind of thinking by in cliches or stereotypes, instead of wanting to have a new paradigm of RO that aspire to be fully cognizant of a multicultural, multiracial society, what it should have did was it should have taken up Alistair McIntyre's question of what kind of agreement can we have in terms of moral, spiritual development when there isn't when there is no longer a shared Christian culture. That to me would have been a far more robust set of questions, and it would have led to a far more robust tools, if you like, to help facilitate spiritual development.
Yeah, but the way I see it, with the change of religious observance, when they redefined it, if you like, it seemed to me that they knew full well they were doing it. They were effectively doing away with religious observance. But they should have really called it time for reflection or whatever, because the description of it, I mean, at one point, it virtually says, if you're actually going to do something that's religious observance, that should maybe be a side stream or optional or whatever. But I think they avoided the controversy of saying we are scrapping religious observance by redefining it as something which is not remotely religious observance. It's like you say, it's this vague spirituality instead. Yeah,
I would agree broadly with that, Richard, but not entirely. One of the things that we were told was that this is part of the kind of, if you like, the delivery of the new RO guidelines. Everybody was under the impression that this was, this was a new paradigm to solve everybody's problems, or that every school across the land was to adopt this. Remember, my own reading of it, and you're absolutely right, it is open to different interpretations. My understanding was that, for example, denominational schools, the 1/3 of non-denominational secondary schools that were identified as doing very well, it was as if my understanding was that the RO guidelines were saying, you keep doing what you're doing. But for those schools in which there is no great expertise or tradition, or there is no shared set of values, then this new paradigm is for you. So, but teachers themselves were confused. Teachers and head teachers who felt they were doing a very good job suddenly felt that because there was new guidelines, it was an implicit critique of what they were already doing. Now, my own interpretation, Richard, is that it wasn't necessarily. What you have to remember is that the reason there was this new set of guidelines issued was precisely because 2/3 of secondary schools, non-denomination, were doing such a bad job of it that the inspectors felt that they had to draw attention to it. So, I mean, listen, the plain fact is that, I mentioned previously that most of these kids would be unchurched Christians, that they no longer practice. So, teachers could rightly say, look, we can't do Christian worship because there is no common cultural community of faith. So it becomes much more problematic. And I think what needs to be developed in Scotland is a new set of tools, if you like, geared towards spiritual development, but from not necessarily from a religious point of view. So, yeah, I fully accept that it gives, kind of secular head teachers the right and the permission to develop that. But I personally didn't see it as a kind of carte blanche that said every school has to do this. It was more for you now have the option if you don't have a Christian community in your school.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but the idea of spirituality has been redefined, hasn't it? It's maybe decades ago now. Whereas spirituality, I think, used to be understood as, a very religious concept. Spirituality would be praying and worshiping, whatever. Whereas now it could be listening to music, enjoying nature, friendship, whatever. It's become a very, very broad concept. So to bring in a spiritual element, I mean, again, that can be done now with a contemporary understanding, without any reference to any religious content at all.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, and lots of the documentation that was issued, I mean, the kind of basic imagery, etc. It's all very, nice pictures of nature, etc. You're absolutely right, Richard. Head teachers and teachers themselves are confused. If you take away the religious idea, then they don't know what spiritual development looks like. If you have this notion of spiritual development, but you don't attach it to a religious tradition, you're right. They have great difficulty in imagining what it would look like.
Yeah.
And so, those people who are able to kind of who know what they're doing in terms of their Christianity, they can easily accommodate that. But I think the great opportunity is for people who are non-Christians or who are non-religious, is to face the question, what on earth does spiritual development look like for us?
Mm-hmm.
And so even I would say that even people who are no longer Christian or never were, they too have great difficulties. And of course, now we can get into all kinds of history of ideas stuff, but moral philosophers, people like Alistair MacIntyre, he would say that a purely secular ethic has yet to develop.
Mm-hmm.
And moral philosophers have been trying to come up with a non-religious ethic that everybody can agree upon, and they have absolutely failed. So it isn't surprising that there's a hard-pressed teacher in a secondary school somewhere who's normally teaching physics or music, likewise is going to need help with this.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Do you think there's an extent that the educational establishment has reached to find alternative bodies of teaching, like human rights and the Shonari well-being indicators, and these take the place that used to be occupied by Christian teaching in schools? I think human rights in particular, I think it's spoken about the way the Bible would have been spoken about in the past. It's the foundation of the moral values of the school. Yeah. Everything we do links back to the human rights. But I think they're completely inadequate, and they're pressing them into service for a job that they're not suitable to do. Well, but it seems there's a pretty determined effort to do it.
As a sociologist, Richard, I look at it like this. What we're witnessing in Scotland from the 60s and 70s is a huge empirical experiment on how to erect political systems, moral systems out with Christianity. And, it's from what I've seen, the results are quite meager. So you're referring to those various kind of new content, but a kind of vague humanistic point of view. It doesn't satisfy even bright primary sevens. They want something with intellectual content. And as I say, if you have the best philosophers in the world being unable to have a post-traditional system of morality that people can cohere around and agree upon, then you're just not going to get teachers or a body of experts being able to put one concoct one and roll it out as the new religious observance paradigm.
Mm-hmm.
But in many ways, if you like, it's a good thing. We're actually putting to the test whether or not you can have if you like, a kind of post-traditional morality. You know, I mean, maybe one of the things I can talk about later on, Richard, when I'm talking about some of the stuff that I do at university, we could maybe get on to that. But one of the things I always tell my sociology students is that they're the first generation who have tried to live without ancestors. And they're the first generation that are having to figure out how to live without tradition. Mm-hmm. That's never happened before. And, you know, there's a lot of casualties involved in this, Richard, but there's also tremendous opportunities. You know, in many ways, for example, I mean, you know, you could, my own, as a sociologist, for example, I mean, I have great respect for a moral thinker like Alistair MacIntyre. Alistair MacIntyre might look at the world in terms of competing systems of morality. I, as a sociologist, don't see the world like that. I look at the generations born since the 1960s onwards. They have only ever known, during their primary socialization, material affluence, education, and freedom at an existential level. Now, what the vast majority of people have done is they have tried to live lives outside of tradition. And if you like, their children are living the consequences of that experiment. And it's rather sobering. Some of the great optimism of the 60s and 70s are now embarrassing. And if you like, policymakers now have a new set of empirical evidence to look at. Some of these great facile notions of being able to, you know, slip the bonds of history or to live without ancestors. These kinds of ideas are now seen as woefully inadequate in terms of moral philosophy or in terms of teaching kids. And I think that's, you know, one of the things, you know, as I mentioned, there's a lot of damage that's done by freedom, if you like. I mean, I could tell you some horror stories about some of the you know, almost nihilistic young people that I'm privileged to teach. But this kind of tremendous sense that, you know, for example, I will tell my third year students, you know, the ones who are, say, genuine millennials that are born in the 21st century, I'll tell them that they're the most freest generation in the history of the planet. But they'll sit there, you know, looking at me, utterly unimpressed by that. There's a great distinction made by Isaiah Berlin, and he talks about negative and positive freedom. So on the one hand, yes, it is true to say that you know, generations nowadays they have never been freer, but they now face as an existential problem something that previous generations never had to face. They now ask as an existential question, freedom for what? And they don't have an answer. And this is what's driving the question, but the kind of nihilism. A lot of young people that I teach, they don't know what their freedom is for. Their culture isn't coherent around answers to that question. So that, you know, so what happens is that they make it up as they go along, and there's all kinds of you know, errors in thinking and decision making. One of the things, for example, I'm doing, the COVID situation has put a bit of a dampener on it. One of the things that I'm going to do with my senior students in sociology at Queen Margaret is I want to have some kind of lunchtime seminar series where students themselves are able to ask questions about what is the new shift in freedom that, you know, younger generations have to make. You know, they now face as an existential problem, not a philosophical problem, but as an existential problem. What is it my freedom for? And one of the things I want them to learn to do is that it's a sociological question. So it's a question that they have in common. And to be able to think about it sociologically, I think is really interesting, because one of the things I always try to kind of help my students to realize is that they're at a place where previous young people have never been. This idea of having to kind of, if you like, decide what freedom looks like, from the very get-go. To kind of, if there is ever a generation born free of tradition, it is this generation. But the kind of light at the end of the tunnel, if you like, Richard, is that therefore this generation is the generation that is able to say, or it is able to feel the lack of coherent answers, and so they'll be able to sift, if you like, some of the kind, like you were mentioning earlier on, Richard, primary 7 kids, secondary school kids, third year university students, they can see through, vague humanist nonsense, The great question as to whether people can live free of tradition, free of ancestors. A lot of students are saying the answer is no. So they live it as an existential condition. You don't need to kind of ask them to go away and read Alistair MacIntyre to know that. It's because they have seen, they themselves, through their parents or through their own lives, they've seen the cost of trying to live without tradition. And oftentimes it's not pretty. Oftentimes, there's a lot of kind of kids that go to, I could give all kinds of examples of exchanges with students. One of the things that's clear among students is that they're very much colonized by a kind of radical relativism. And, no matter how strong their beliefs are, it's almost a taboo to say that there are things like objective truths, or there's objective moral realities.
Just a few years ago, I remember hearing on the radio, I think it was a philosophy tutor at Cambridge University, and she was saying new students that come in, first-year students, are an absolute nightmare. They've been through school, and they have a discussion. It's just say, right, is this right or wrong? And they'll say, depends on your point of view. So that's the most sophisticated answer, that you sort of rise above all these other questions. As you said, it's really hard work to get them to actually say anything else apart from that, to actually come down on one side of the fence.
And as a sociologist, Richard, I probably have to say, sociologists have played their fair share in that kind of false kind of skepticism. I regularly get kind of, quite sophisticated third and fourth year students, and they'll trot out these kind of silly little phrases like, truth is an effect of power, or all truth is interpretation. And of course, that's my bread and butter, so we jump into the questions. But it's absolutely, I see it's almost like a conveyor belt. That students are kind of from the very get-go, or I shouldn't say them all, because clearly that, the closer you get to a population, the more it's different. But there's a sense in which I see, students, and they've come through this long history of a kind of, radical relativism. But at some point, the penny does drop, precisely what you're hinting at, Richard. And that's one of the things I do with students. I'll say to students, you cannot live your life without moral certitude. It's impossible. And you don't need to be a philosopher. Just reflect on your own life, your experience. Or things like, for example, even although students will live their lives in the truth, in their consciousness, they have all kinds of relativistic notions that go on. So one of the things I do with my students, for example, is I say, you live your life according to absolute contingent truths. And they say, well, what do you mean by that? So we talk about, this whole idea of, we do indeed, as a matter of our experience, share a common world, and we're not wrong about it. So it's almost as if you're trying to push back the tide of this this relativism that these kids have been imbibing with mother's milk, and a lot of education is about trying to challenge that. And
I remember when I was teaching, I remember a very clever boy having a conversation with him, and again, it'd be very relativistic, so I was getting desperate. I said, how about what Hitler did? Right or wrong? Depends on your point of view. And you run to that. But if you know, if one class is allowed to go to lunch 10 minutes earlier than another, it's not fair. How can this be allowed to happen? That give account for this. This is just not right.
Yeah,
It's a total thing. Even the most trivial matters, they'll suddenly become pretty absolutist when it intersects with their own interests. But as soon as it goes into, they go into philosophical debate mode.
yes.
Then it goes to relativism again.
Yeah, I mean, I always recommend to my students when we talk about moral relativism, I always tell them to read Alistair McIntyre's After Virtue, and trying to make Aristotelians out of them. But yeah, it's astonishing, Richard, how the tremendous disconnect between how people live their lives and the ideas that they have. There's a total disconnect, I mean, I have never, ever in my life met a real moral relativist. I've met a theoretical relativist. I've never actually met somebody who lives their life like that. Anyway, but yeah, it's so. I mean, but the good news is, Richard, that bright young kids, this will be the task that defines their life for many of them. Trying to, if you like, because of their cultural situation, that they're going to have to think themselves up from the very ground, and they are the first, hopefully the only generation that have to do this. But I would also say that it is absolutely society-wide. So we're not just talking about schools; we're talking about parliaments. We're talking about education systems, universities. Absolutely. I mean, to kind of take it to the highest level, it's about being responsible for a kind of Western tradition. I'll give you a classroom example, Richard. I remember saying to one of my third years, my usual thing about kids born from the 60s onwards, they have this wonderful socialization characterized by affluence, freedom, and education. And the freest generation on the planet. And I remember one student saying, "Yeah, but we still are not allowed to kill ourselves." And I thought to myself, "Oh, that was a fantastic answer." And of course, soon we may have that right foisted upon us.
Well, it says that. I mean, suicide is actually not illegal. What it means is the right to have someone help him.
Yeah,
someone from the state helping him. Yeah.
So I mean, it's. Maybe this is the kind of this ability to kind of think in terms of ethics and rationality, and my God, trying to do that without a kind of, but I mean, my own kind of commitments involve Christianity, involve kind of Aristotelian philosophy, involve natural law, all these things that are no longer, But again, I mean, I suppose when you see people trying to live without tradition and without ancestors, it makes you kind of sharp as to what your own ancestors and tradition, what you want it to be, and what you want to kind of pass on to your children, etc.
Yeah.
So yeah, it does make you sharper in terms of the battle that's to be fought.
Yeah, but it's often quite explicit, isn't it? The idea that we need to leave behind the value system of previous generations in terms of parenting style, moral system, basically everything. It's a very strong cultural movement, isn't it? That the previous generations have messed everything up, and the younger generations are going to fix it all and create something new from the ground up again.
Well, part of the issue, Richard, and this sometimes I do have some certain sympathy with it. That certainly, when Christianity, for example, was nicely ensconced into teaching, and it was largely unquestioned, that generation of politicians, policymakers, teachers, they simply were utterly caught unawares by the revolution of the 60s and 70s. So it would almost be unfair of us to expect them to have articulated answers that are only really existential with the generation that comes afterwards. So I suppose it's a task of, people like myself, maybe younger, who are alive to that as a kind of generational task, But you're right. I mean, in many ways, now I use this as a metaphor. in many ways, kind of let's metaphorically burn things down and see what survives. Putting things to the test, putting traditions or positions to the test, I'm absolutely in favour of that, and to see what works and what doesn't. So there is I mean, that's just part of the burden of being modern, I suppose. Truths or truth claims or traditions having now to stand on their own 2 feet, especially one of my own kind of themes that I talk about, Richard, is this notion that one of the things that's characteristic of generations born from the 60s is that they now live in societies where the kind of coercive nature and grip of society has never been less. So, whatever it is, whatever identity, whatever tradition they want to belong to, they now have to put it together themselves. And there's something terribly scary but terribly liberating about it. It's almost as if we now no longer have the option but to work out our own authenticity. And, listen, there's lots of casualties, but I suppose, that is the new terrain upon which a solution has to be built.
I think it's the nature of tradition. When a tradition is very much part of the culture, what's inevitably going to happen is that most people will follow the tradition without fully understanding the reason behind it. And then when it starts decaying, often the culture is not very good at defending the traditions because people are not in the habit of explaining, of arguing why they're important. Then the people who do question them can't find anyone to defend it. And so it seems like an irrational thing. And then when it's gone, on some occasions, the mess starts to emerge. And then you'd hope at that stage people are, hang on a minute, right, we can see what's gone wrong here. Maybe we can understand why that fence was there that we took down a few years ago.
Absolutely. No, that's so true, Richard. When it's no longer a kind of a philosophical problem that's bandied around among elites, but becomes an existential problem. Working class localities and communities. The kind, if you like, the kind of social class that has done least well from the triumph of liberalism. That's something that I'm particularly sensitive to. I know a lot of teachers and some of the stories about kind of the real problems that family breakdown when that tradition no longer has a kind of social support and it has to stand on its own 2 feet. What you often find is, just as you said, people don't have the financial or the cultural resources in order to kind of sustain that. They don't have that kind of long socialization and education into that value, so they are kind of particularly vulnerable to what sociologists like Emile Durkheim calls a condition of anomie, a kind of normlessness that results from the liberation of desire, etc. The ability to kind of be able to kind of handle freedom if you don't have traditions, it can wreak havoc in lives.
G.K. Chesterton said, if you find a fence, if you think, I just can't see the point of this fence, that's not a fence to take down. You leave that one there. If you do understand the point of it and then think, well, we don't need that anymore, that's a fence you can maybe take down. But it tends to work the other way now. People think, I can't see the point in that. So they take it down. So instead of making the efforts to understand what the point of it is, to research, but maybe it's hard to do that until it's gone. You don't realize the consequences until it's gone. And the cows are in your front garden or whatever.
And suddenly you realize you don't want to live without ancestors. You don't want to live without tradition. Because it's utterly exhausting if you're trying to build something without that. One of my favorite quotes from Chesterton on this whole theme, Richard, is where he says, people don't know what they're doing because they don't know what they're undoing.
And
the kind of the dismantling that goes on, and it's one of the. I have a particular module, and it's called the Sociology of Liberation. I teach to the third years, and I have so many fantastic quotes from radicals from the 60s and 70s talking about liberation, and then I quote them 30 years later, and they'll say things like, in the 60s and 70s, we used to talk about liberation without embarrassment, but now all of that is gone. And again, you know, what is now a matter of empirical data is that the generations that try to, if you like, show history a clean pair of heels, they are busily retrenching, you know, daily. And in the Scottish context, Richard, this I think is really an interesting question. One of the things that the Scots have done since the 60s, and maybe we can talk about this at some length, Richard. I know you wanted to talk about perhaps a family party policy that I disagree with. One of the things that the Scots have done from the 60s and 70s, now that they're affluent and free and you know, have tremendous education, is that they, if you like, they have rebuilt fences. They have reappropriated traditions. If you like, the kind of Christian legacy of sovereignty, parliament, nationhood. They have reframed their political existence using these, if you like, you know, frames that were put in place by others. So there has been, if you like, a kind of a resurrection of these, if you like, pre-modern frames, Richard. But that gets us into a whole kind of other discussion. You know, the resurrection of the nation in its political form.
So what you're saying there, that you feel within this as a vacuum, values vacuum, purpose vacuum, people have found purpose and meaning in nationalism.
Yes, they have resurrected in political form the nation. So, for example, for generations, you had a national identity that wasn't politicized. It was there, it was real, it was cultural, it was historical, but it wasn't mobilized in politics. Interestingly, it has been now. And I think that is a kind of recognition that there are huge limits as to, you know, how far you can go without tradition, without ancestors. And I think the Scottish case is a fascinating example of, you know, as you say, it is only when you have the ability to kind of do something about, you know, have a new sense of agency, thanks to affluence, education, and freedom and existential level. That's what the Scots have done. They've erected these new fences. Maybe that's, as an Englishman, maybe that's not a good thing to hear, Richard. But this sense of erecting fences in order not to lose something that is now essential. I mean, one of the things, for example, you might want to look at it like this. The Scots, more than any other nation on the planet, they try to do modernity, but without what their ancient ancestors put in place, without sovereignty, without nationhood, in a political sense, and without sovereignty. And they've now realised that it doesn't work. So all of these fences have to be refixed, if you like. Now, that again ties into my argument that what the Scots born since the 60s are doing is they're making these fences anew. So, you know, it's like the kind of Hegel's thing about Minerva's owl only flies at dusk. Once one phase of modernity now comes to an end, we resurrect something else, and if you like, it's the a kind of a more ancient way of imagining ourselves politically, culturally, etc.
But that's interesting. I would say, if that's the case, Richard, I can imagine that it is. I think that's not the surface of Scottish nationalism. That's not its public face. You hear the SNP argue for nationalism. No, there's not a lot about, you know, our ancestors and our great traditions. It tends to be more in the stream of thought that, you know, we're progressives. We need to build something new. We need to get away from the way things were. So it's more you know, leaving imperial Britain and building a modern secular, you know, progressive society. It's more like that. But I think underneath that, in terms of actual Scottish nationalists, I think these other factors, this seeking a meaning within the re-establishment of a Scottish nation, I think that's a very genuine effect. And I think it's interesting what I see is the disconnect between the SNP version of nationalism and the nationalism of actual Scottish nationalists that I meet. So would you agree with that? Or?
Absolutely. My tuppence worth on nationalism is a sociological analysis, Richard. I have absolutely no interest in the the nationalism of the SNP leadership. These are entirely different things. The reason the SNP is successful is because they're able to ride that shift in tectonic plates, as Tom Nairn once called it. You cannot be a successful political party unless you are more or less in alliance with the sociological currents or the sociological direction of travel. If you go against it, then you're not going to have traction with the kind of collective. But so I totally agree with you. It's a sociological analysis, and I don't really care if SNP people agree with it or not, because it's not at that level, Richard. The kind of civic nationalism at the SNP that you're talking about, if that was its only reality, it would be a very superficial thing, but it's not. There are these kind of macro sociological forces that are in alliance with nationalism. That's what has made it so popular. It's not because people are poring over SNP manifestos. It's because it answers a need that has been liberated after being suppressed, thanks to poverty, thanks to the coercive reality of society in many generations' lives. Now that these are no longer the case, these things that have been repressed for generations are now able to take form as they never have been able to take form. So, as a sociological analysis, I'm giving not a kind of
that's interesting. Another line I've heard, I don't know what you make of this, is the Scottish nationalism gained strength the longer period of peace we have. So, you understand that Scottish nationalism started making some progress within the 1800s. In this sort of century of relative peace in Europe, it was gaining a bit of ground then.
Yes,
but then the world wars knocked it right back down to square one. Then another sustained period of peace. Would you imagine if there? I wondered whether coronavirus might be a suitable external threat to push Scottish nationalism back. But I would argue maybe the opposite happened, or it's been neutral. But if, say, there was a genuine military threat to NATO or to the UK, do you think that would put Scottish nationalism back on the back foot again?
Anything, Richard, that makes existential a kind of a UK-wide sense of solidarity, absolutely. You're absolutely right. And but by that same token, Richard, nationalism only comes to life among people that are not born into the empire. Once you have primary socializations in Scotland, out with the context of empire, then this new political frame can happen. But for example, you're absolutely right. Britain's finest hour, the existential threat in the Second World War. People who are, in their late 70s, and 80s, they will still have some kind of lived experience of, an existential experience of being, British in an unquestioned way, in a kind of even triumphalist way. And now, because of that tremendous threat that was faced together. So you're absolutely right, Richard. When you no longer have these all British realities, it's, if you like, the kind of cultural cupboard is bare. Increasingly, the reality of Britishness is becoming less and less. What mediates Britishness? Television, passport, other kind of one or two events. But as a lived reality in people's lives, like especially if you're Scottish and you're working class, for example, you're no longer part of an all British industry. You're no longer part of an all British trade union. So being British becomes abstract. So it doesn't have a purchase in people's kind of existential sense of self.
Yeah, I think sense of national identity is entirely subjective. So I can look at my upbringing and experiences and can see quite clearly what led me to be a unionist very firmly. But I can see the people brought up in Scotland. I can see how their experiences would lead them to a different feeling, but it is ultimately subjective. So I think the arguments about it, I think when there's any sort of debate about secession, the arguments end up about the currencies and economics or whatever. But that's never the real issue. The real issue is the subjective sense of national identity that you can't rationally argue about. But you might be able to try and scare people about various things, but ultimately that's what's going to count, the subjective sense of national identity. And it's not amenable to rational argument. There's ways of influencing it in the long term. Like I would say the SNP in its running of Scotland, often its decisions will be geared towards weakening a sense of dependence and identity with the United Kingdom, strengthening a sense of Scottish identity, while the UK government's trying to do the opposite.
Yeah.
At the moment, I think the Scottish government's in a stronger position to push forward its objectives than the UK government is. I think it's heading in that direction.
I would take issue, Richard, with the characterization of nationalism as a subjective thing. It's not. It's an intersubjective, generational zeitgeist that's shared by, so I would say national identity is more fundamental than, say, for example, personal identity. There's a kind of we before the, or beyond the I, there's a we. For example, one of the reasons why the union is dead is when you have kind of, your one-eyed 80-year-old granny who was born into the empire, voted Labour all of her life, suddenly saying, I'm now voting Labour. Once your old granny starts kind of, the penny drops, the union's finished because they're the last people who are going to get it. Now, when you look at, for example, if you're born from the 60s onwards, I've just told you about, they're characterized sociologically by these kind of three new things of material affluence, freedom at an existential level, and higher education. These kids born from the 60s onwards, they come to consciousness, in the 80s, okay? So from 79, 83, 87, 92, you have these historic victories for the Labour Party in Scotland, only to be governed by politicians in a party that was never voted for. So you have an entire generation that is born, and when they come to adult political consciousness, they realize that in order to secure agency, they have to politicize the nation, because it's a rigged game. If you're only 10% of the population, the game is always going to be rigged against you. So, you're just the kind of the tail, and the dog decides what happens. So I don't think it's subjective at all, Richard. It's part of the lived experience of a generation that is able to, for sociological reasons, politicize a nation in ways that weren't possible before. So
I would say to that, if you think about, say, the people of, Liverpool and Manchester, they could say throughout their period, we didn't get the government that we voted for.
Yes,
okay?
But Richard,
but when they said that, they weren't meaning, they were saying that quite rightly, but they were also by we. But that's a good way of testing. What do you understand by we? Who is us and who's them?
Right. Okay.
And the decision of who you're going to regard as us and who you regard as them, I think it is ultimately subjective.
No, it's not. What people in Liverpool don't have available to them is a national identity that they can mobilize around in order to change the political game. They don't have that option. The Scots did. So,
but still, in Scotland, there's a lot of people who would say us is British, is the United Kingdom. That's us. And then you've got other Scots who say, no, us is Scots. That's we. That's what they use, we. So with the SNP, when Nicola Sturgeon talks about we and us, it's always Scotland. Whereas when unionists talk about it, they use the same words to talk to the United Kingdom. And I don't think there's any rational argument to decide between them. It's just the sum of people's experiences through their life, which has generated the sense of loyalty and bonds that leads to those.
No, I agree with that. But listen, just look at the work of, some sociologists of Scotland, and they'll tell you that, whenever you have like the Scottish National Attitude Survey, etc., Scots increasingly define themselves as British, sorry, as Scottish, not British, and certainly among, there's a generational aspect to it. So the most likely kinds of people that you're going to identify as British today would be elderly female Protestant, middle class, So yes, you do have a mixture. Of course, you're right. But if I was a unionist, Richard, I would be very worried as to, how a sense of union or a sense of kind of all British identity, I would be really worried as to how it's going to be reproduced in the future. What are the kind of social carriers of that identity?
I think that's a big enough problem in England, let alone in Scotland. I think generally Western nations are having difficulty putting forward an inspiring vision of what they stand for and a pride in their history. And when that's put alongside, like you say, a competing national identity, then it is going to be prime time for nationalist movements. Now, we're overrunning. We'll need to tie up very quickly. Do you want to just say
already
have a last comment on that? Yeah, we're over an hour.
Well, no, just to say that I really enjoy this, Richard. There's all kinds of, there's a great phrase from the German philosopher Martin Heidegger. He says, when you try to solve one philosophical problem, you end up trying to solve every other true philosophical problem. And it's like when you and I are chatting, Richard, I'm very conscious of, there's all kinds of areas in which, we can move effortlessly into. I think there is so many issues and problems that you and I share in common, even though we have differences. There is a sense in which they are really connected. Like the tremendous difficulties in, how to have a kind of political system where people, are able to feel part of. What new developments have to happen in order for people to feel that they can participate? These are great questions. Politicians ask them, policymakers, sociologists, people who are just interested in these issues. So, no, it's great to have a chance to chat about these things with you. And, thanks for the invite.
Thanks for coming on. Till next time. I'm sure we could have gone for another. There's lots of other areas we could have covered. But that was really interesting hearing about your professional research and the other things we've gone to as well. So thank you very much. As I say, it'd be great if you could come back sometime in the new year. I'm sure there'll be lots more we could talk about as well. Well, thanks for watching, everyone, and we'll see you live for real next week. Good night.